it's impossible to find a country with a GDP per capita of less than $40,000 that has a record of even 20 years of democracy. So India is by far the most democratic country of its kind, of a country that is, and this is not an insult. Some Indians take it as an insult when I say poor, and they say it's only poor because of the British or it's only poor because of the Mughals. Look, India has been poor for 1,000 years. It's not India's fault, perhaps. We can debate the reasons for India's poverty, but the simple fact is India was born as a country as poor as the countries of Africa. In fact, most of the countries of Africa were relatively richer than India in 1947. And yet, India is a democracy when all those countries of Africa, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, none of them became democracies straight out of the bat with independence, and none of them remain democracies. It really is an incredible fact, an incredible social science mystery that has remained unsolved. And the fundamental question of the book is, why did that happen?
Why did that happen? Yeah, so it's extraordinary. For most of us Indians or Hindus, right? We tend to take it for granted that in India is a democracy. It was been a democracy, and we don't consider it an extraordinary democracy. Really speaking, we worry constantly about its its internal challenges and so on. And it takes somebody studying the spectrum of democracies around the world and comparing them, in a comparative sociological study to kind of zero in on this fact that India is an outlier, right? It is not part of the normal sense of what a democracy uh, is or should be, right? So when you brought up this Polish researcher back in the late 90s, did he actually call out the fact that India was an outlier, that it was an
Oh
extraordinary situation?
yes,
He
yes.
did.
It's a major question left by the book of, why is India a democracy when all of our models predict it? And the exact quotes from the book are in my own book. But why is India a democracy when their models predicted that India should not have been a democracy from birth, and if it was born as a democracy, its first election should have been its last.
Mm.
All the same predictors that apply to India apply to Pakistan. And of course, Pakistan was never a democracy from the beginning. Uh, Yet the contrast is clear. There's only been one major book in the West in English that attempted to square that circle of try to say why did India become a democracy and Pakistan an autocracy? It's by a scholar who's now at Oxford named Maya Tudor. And in her book, she traced it to secularism. And she said, well, the Congress Party was secular. The Muslim League was anti-secular. Was the Muslim League. And as a result of the commitment to secularism of the Congress Party, India became a democracy. And part of the reason my book is called Dharma Democracy is because I think that thesis is completely false, that Indian democracy owes its basis to the character of its Hindu society. India is not a democracy despite its Hindu faith. India is a democracy because of its
Mm.
Hindu faith.
Yeah.
And that's perhaps a very unpopular view in political science today.
Yeah.
But I think there's a lot of there's a lot of good reasons for believing that.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, in one sense, right, the this insight, um, for you to state it so clearly that India is a democracy, Indian democratic, uh, the practice of democracy in India is successful because of its Hindu society, and because of its dharma. It's actually an extraordinary insight for a non-Hindu, for a Westerner, right? And the tendency among Western scholars is to, like the one you mentioned, Maya Tudor,
Mhm.
is to look for the root causes for the success of democracy in primarily Western ideas, Western principles, Western the development of thought, but not anything indigenous, because indigenous, Hindu thought
Yeah.
supposed to be old and ancient and
Well,
obsolete largely.
yeah, it's not that it's not as bad as it sounds. So I think the reason that Western political scientists have had blinkers on and they've only been able to see in one direction, which is secularism,
Mhm.
is that the story of democracy in the West is the story of a reaction against religion. In the West, if you read political science of democracy, if you get any standard textbook, it will say the rise of the middle class led to the creation of a civil society outside of the religious sphere, an independent civil society that was not part of the church and not part of the state. And that independent civil society supported the institutions like a free press, like societies of people coming together to have political discussions. This whole realm of institutions that ultimately educated people for democracy and prepared people for democracy. Now, that story depends on a particular kind of religion, Christianity. And Christianity, despite a spate of books in recent years suggesting that Christianity somehow is responsible for democracy, the consensus view until about 20 years ago was that Christianity is completely anathema to democracy. And of course, if you consider Christianity, it is an authoritative religion. There's a book, the Bible. There are in most, not all Christian denominations, in most Christian denominations, there are bishops and councils that determine what the theology will be. If you want to become a member of the church, you have to accept its theology. There's no other way in. Plus, and crucially for a sociologist, Christianity does not unite people, it divides people. People who go to a Catholic church cannot take communion in a Presbyterian church. People who go to a Presbyterian church cannot take communion in an Anglican church, in a Lutheran church. That is, all of these churches divide people. And we can even see that symbolically in the fact that they all hold their services Sunday morning, which means if you wanted to go to two or three churches, you'd have to run from church to try to get from one service to the other. You can't do it. They hold their services at the same time because the very strong expectation is that you will only go to one. You will not form connections across sects within Christianity. Now, of course, the Hindu faith differs entirely from that, where there are a plethora of connections. Where if you're a Shivite, you might very well want to go to the Ayodhya temple to pay your respects to Lord Ram. If you are a devotee of one, you can always be a devotee of the other as well. You may have a god who is your family god or your village god or the one you feel closest to in your heart, but you don't disrespect all of those other gods, right? And it's perfectly acceptable and normal in Hindu society for people to not only attend and worship in with other sects, but to go on pilgrimages to visit the sites of multiple sects. So the Hindu faith, rather than dividing Indian society, unites Hindu society. And so where in the West, we've looked for civil society to be in a sphere outside religion, it must be secular. And that's why Maya Tudor in her work discounted anything Hindu, because in her mind, and she only wrote the book as a graduate student. I mean, she's done lots of things since then, but she wrote the book as a PhD student. And in her mind, she'd been taught religion is what happens. I'm sorry, civil society is what happens outside the sphere of religion. And so she said, well, it has to be secular to be civil society. Now, that would have been true if she'd been studying the West. And it would have been true if she'd been studying Islam. One of the chief problems of Muslim majority countries is that civil society outside the mosque has not fully developed. Civil society is very much in the mosque. And if you compare, for example, the Muslim Brotherhood and the very early history of the Muslim Brotherhood and I know RSS people hate the comparison, but to the early history of the RSS, the Muslim Brotherhood was founded in the mosques and from the very beginning in Egypt worked through the mosques. Where you met was in the mosque, and what the Muslim Brotherhood did was attempt to work with the mosque and Sunni mosques, not Shia mosques, right? So it was a sectarian organization. Of course, the RSS, while it is thoroughly Hindu, uh, is not a religious organization. It's a civil society organization. Now, to a Western political scientists, the RSS is by definition not civil society because it is, whether they like to admit it or not. I mean, there's some debate within the RSS. Is it a Hindu organization or is it an Indian organization? Let's face facts. It is overwhelmingly a Hindu organization. Uh, but that doesn't mean it's not civil society. It's the largest civil society organization in India. And there are a whole panoply of civil society organizations. The Sangh Parv are most clearly associated with the RSS, but a whole panoply of civil society organizations that are not RSS, that are not Sangh Parvar, that are people coming together, but again, overwhelmingly with some connection to religion. And even if you look at an organization that's explicitly religious, like the Ramakrishna Mission, the Ramakrishna Mission, well, yes, it is a religious organization, but it's not a church in the sense that we would view a church or a religious organization in the West. It's a civil society organization run and staffed by monks who are completely committed to its cause. It's a Hindu organization. There's no doubt about it, but it does a lot of what we would think civil society would do in the West. And not just the Ramakrishna Mission. Again, this story repeats itself over and over that civil society in India is thoroughly suffused with religion. And thus, to Western political science, it was invisible.
Right.
Because to Western political science, religious means it's not civil society by definition.
And that is a vestige from the Great Enlightenment era thought. I mean, I read an article by Immanuel Kant on
Mhm.
what is enlightenment, right?
Yes, this, the
And
famous work. Yeah,
the famous work. And as a Hindu, right, when we hear the word enlightenment, we understand it in terms of spiritual terms, in spiritual
sure.
terms, like attaining to some sort of realization and so on. But this was so different. And,
Yeah.
the European Enlightenment was really kind of Europe freeing itself from the stranglehold of religion
Yes.
in
Enlightenment meant freeing from the darkness
yeah,
of religion in Kant's view.
in Kant's view,
Yeah,
exactly. And so there's an arc of secularization that Europe went, from the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, the Reformation, the Renaissance, and then into the Age of Enlightenment. So they split apart these two worlds, the religious and the secular. And in India, it's very intertwined, like you've observed. But I want to make one point here, which is, as a Hindu, we do not generally consider the varieties of sects and traditions and groups and different gods and communities, as really a strength. We oftentimes we think of it as a, more of a liability, because that's one of the reasons why India uh, got invaded and conquered and colonized for so long, because they couldn't muster a political unity to defend the whole nation. Parts would defend themselves, but then they also aligned and got aligned with other parts in ways that were not necessarily helpful for the whole nation. And so that's part of the reason why there was such a long period of darkness, which I would call the Hindu Dark Age. You mentioned 1,000 years. So that is really the case. So I'm surprised, if I may put it this way, that you have identified that the diversity in Hindu society as a strength of the society, and in some ways its ability to connect with other parts, um, you know, different parts of this fragments of this society, being able to make linkages as one of the reasons for the success of Indian democracy. So can you
Well,
can you speak to that a little bit?
well, Hindu society has always been united, and we have lots of evidence that even in the Mughal era, that Indians from Hindus from South India were still making the pilgrimage to, for example, the Vishwanath temple in Varanasi, right? So the pilgrimage routes survived even through Mughal occupation. The difference is that in the modern era, we saw the political unity of Hindu faith. And that can be put down to India's nation builders. The first and foremost, I mean, I know there were proto nation builders before him, but first and foremost, Swami Vivekananda. Swami Vivekananda took Hindu faith and attempted to build a rhetoric of nation around it, to create a sense among Hindus that they weren't just members of one faith. Now, it's currently become fashionable, especially in Western circles, to say there's no such thing as one Hindu faith. There are 35 different Hindu faiths and they're all separate. And that's ridiculous. There's clearly been one Hindu faith for as far back, like 3,000, 4,000 years, as far back as we have any documentary evidence. But there wasn't a sense of one nation. And if India had remained independent or had it become independent in 1850, before, let's say unity really only started with 1857 and the Great Revolt. If we go back before 1857, it's quite possible we would have a nation called Bengal and a nation called Maharashtra and a nation called Kerala and a nation called Tamil Nadu. That is, there's no reason all of these had to be a single nation. And anyone who rebels at that, let's point out that, Nepal is there as a Hindu majority nation, and it's not part of India. It has special relationship with India, but it's clearly a separate nation with its own national identity. All of the regions of India could similarly have had different national identities while remaining Hindu. There's no conflict there. What India's nation builders did was mobilize that religious unity into a national unity, creating a sense among Indians from throughout the country that they all belonged in a single nation, not in separate nations based on their own language, for example. In Europe, most nations are based on language. So that nation building effort had to be done. People had to learn that they were Indian, not merely Hindu, but Indian as well. And that learning that they were Indian didn't come from the British. I mean, it's easy and it's a common trope of Western writing on India that, Britain united India and created the India we know today. To which I say, well, then what about Bangladesh, Pakistan, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bhutan? Why are all these separate places? No, so the British didn't create the idea that India was united. It's India's nation builders who created the idea that India should be united, and that didn't necessarily extend to these other jurisdictions where people may have rebelled in fundamentally the Muslim majority areas that did not want to be included in this Hindu-dominated Indian nation. But that nation building was absolutely necessary. You can't have, and one of the themes of the book is you can't have a democracy until you have a nation. If you ask why did so many post-colonial democracies fail, it wasn't because they failed in their democratic procedure. It was because once one national group within the country gained political power, it immediately repressed the others. And for Indians, all you have to do is look to Pakistan. Punjabi Pakistan seized political power in the beginning, even though much of the intellectual and for that matter, the much of the vote for Pakistan came from East Pakistan, from Bengal. Nonetheless, Jinnah was from Karachi, and Jinnah located Pakistan in Lahore and in Islamabad. That became Pakistan. Well, what happened when the Awami League won a free election? Punjab, Pakistan couldn't accept that, right? And it had to be divided. And of course, the 1971 war only solidified that division, but the division was inevitable because Pakistan could not survive as a country and be a democracy because there was not a shared sense of national identity. Now, that same thing's not true in India. I mean, a West Bengali is an Indian. Yes, they may speak Bengali, they may have some local pride, but there's no sense in which they're not Indian. And if a West Bengal leader were to become the prime minister, there's no sense in which now West Bengal would rule India and suppress the rest of the country.
Right.
Right. So somewhere that was created, someone had it that didn't just rise out of the soil. Right. There's this European idea that nationalism is based in the soil, and that we're people belong to a nation because of their strong connection to the soil. And that's just not true. People have to be educated into the idea that they belong in one nation. And of course, I already mentioned Swami Vivekananda being at the very core of that. But that whole generation of the Sri Aurobindo, the Lal Bal Pal trio, Rabindranath Tagore, all the people who, for that matter, Mahatma Gandhi, who created the sense that India was one place.
One place.
They
So,
mobilized Hindu religious conceptions into a political idea that India was one nation.
okay. So, Salvatore, I'm going to show another slide, another quotation from your book now.
Sure.
Okay. Uh, on page 130 of your book, you say, this is a quotation, but if there is one thing that India could really teach the world, it is how to run a democracy in a poor non-Western country where liberal individualism has no historical or philosophical roots. Western style democracy has proven as tough sell in the developing world, especially in the deeply religious countries of Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. India's model of a democracy of duties, of a Dharma democracy, might prove more palatable. Okay, so I want to say a couple of things about this. So you say that the success of India's democracy is a great mystery, is a sociological mystery. Okay, so and then you investigate it. How come? What is the source? What is the cause? What are the root causes for this? The relative success of India's democracy, and then you zero in on the word dharma. What is dharma democracy? Help us understand that. And I'll
Well,
also say, I had difficulty understanding it. Okay, in the book, so please.
I use Dharma in two senses. I use Dharma first in the sense of Sanatan Dharma. People will recognize that when I say Dharma, that's a Hindu form of duty.
Hindu dharma, right?
But primarily, I use Dharma to mean duty. And people may complain that Dharma has many meanings beyond duty. I could say that in English, duty has many meanings beyond duty. I mean, if you put a tariff on a country, that's called an import duty. So the idea that a word will have many meanings outside of its core meaning
Mhm.
is not really that important. I mean, dharma means duty, and it's duty in different contexts. And the idea of a duty to the nation, a rashtra dharma, is something that has to be created. People have to feel that they owe some sense of duty to their nation. They're not born with that. They're educated into that, and somebody has to educate them. India's democracy is very much based on the idea of duty. And that idea didn't just come out of the air. It didn't even particularly come from Hindu faith. Something very few Indians are aware, one of the most popular authors of the early 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century, that India's independence leaders grew up with was the Italian writer Giuseppe Mazzini. Now, Mazzini is relatively obscure today, but his book, The Duties of Man, was incredibly influential in the late 19th and early 20th century. Mazzini was an Italian revolutionary. When I say it was incredibly influential, let me just point out something you may not realize. Lala Lajpat Rai translated The Duties of Man into, I think it was Marathi, but he translated it into Indian languages. Savarkar translated The Life of Mazzini into Marathi and then into Hindi. Mahatma Gandhi in Hind Swaraj, where he lays the basis for his program of nonviolent resistance, he specifically says he's doing it because of Mazzini. Right? He doesn't cite the Hindu scriptures. He says, just like Mazzini said, if we want to build a nation, we have to build it on a sense of spirit, a spiritual duty to our nation, not out of a sense of individual ambition. We have to do that in India, and that duty to the nation is that we will suffer and sacrifice for our nation. And
Yeah.
that's where his, now, of course, Ahimsa has a long tradition in Hindu and Jain thinking, but Gandhi specifically cites Mazzini, not anyone else, in talking about the theory of Ahimsa. And so Mazzini's idea that we should have a duty-based nation is something that never caught on in Europe. Of course, Mazzini's Duties of Man was exactly, I mean, it was written, Duties of Man, as a response to the Rights of Man, which was the key document of the French Revolution. It's still in the French Constitution today. And Mazzini said, no, it's not individual rights that make a nation. It's a sense of obligation that makes a nation. Now, I don't think all of these Indian authors got the idea from Mazzini, but they mobilized that Mazzinian rhetoric, which is now forgotten. I mean, virtually nobody in India recognizes that many of the independence leaders of India were citing Giuseppe Mazzini for their ideas. Nonetheless, that idea of a duty to the nation continued to be reflected in Indian thought. Gandhi explicitly said that India has to put duties first, rights second. Aurobindo said, Dharma is the basis of democracy. If you read that essay on Asiatic democracy, he's not talking about religion. When Aurobindo says Dharma is the basis of democracy that Asia must recognize, he's talking about duty. He's using the word Dharma as a specifically Indian framework for thinking about duties. And of course, when Indira Gandhi put the fundamental duties into the Indian Constitution, virtually all of her amendments were reversed, not the fundamental duties, because there was a consensus that, of course, people have fundamental duties to the nation. They're not enforceable. It's not you must do this, you must do this, you must do this. Some of the duties are well, I think one of them is to seek enlightenment, right? Right? I mean, it's scientific and intellectual accomplishment. So that sense of duty to the nation is something that was inculcated in India by a generation of independence leaders who understood duty not as a European word, Mazzini, but as an Indian word, dharma. And so when they taught about duty, they didn't say, yeah, you should recognize duty as the basis of our nationhood because Mazzini said so. They said, no, you should recognize duty because the Bhagavad Gita says so, because Krishna says so, right?
Right.
And so the rhetoric, and again, the number of India's independence leaders who published commentaries on the Bhagavad Gita is incredible. But the Bhagavad Gita can be read as a discourse on duty.
Yeah.
That it's Arjuna. You may want to do this, but it's your duty to do that. To do that,
Mhm. Mhm.
and using the Bhagavad Gita, and Swami Vivekananda used the Bhagavad Gita to talk about duty. And then if we go forward, Radhakrishnan, Sarvapalli Radhakrishnan, the second president of India, he wrote an exegesis of the Bhagavad Gita, a book about the Bhagavad Gita. Gandhi translated the Bhagavad Gita, right? So it's the connection between duty and nationhood in the first half of the 20th century is everywhere
Yeah.
in
So,
India.
so Salvador, I want to point to one particular difficulty that I had in reading your book. Okay. So the concept of dharma is something we Hindus grow up with.
Yeah,
We understand it. It's in our bones. It's in our blood. I mean, it's like we owe something to others. So there is. Very simplistically said, there is, we owe something to our parents, we owe something to our children, we owe something to our spouses, we owe something to the environment. We call it Aushadhiya Dharma. We call, and so on. So there is Yuga Dharma, there is varieties of Raja Dharma, there is Ashrama Dharma, Varna Dharma,
yeah,
so many kinds of dharmas. Okay. And dharma is a very elaborately discussed idea in Hindu literature, in texts, and so on and so forth. However, in your usage of the word dharma, democracy, you are pointing to a particular kind of dharma, which is what you called Rashtra Dharma.
Yes.
Rashtra Dharma. And remarkably, Rashtra Dharma is not so elaborately discussed in Hindu texts. Okay, and then I had to personally acknowledge that, I did not read when the word dharma in your text in your book as Rashtra Dharma right away. So I got a little bit muddled up about how are you calling it dharma? Why? And there was a second reason, and I thought, you know, for the long hoary history of India, the thousands of years of history, India was not a democracy on
No.
that scale. Okay, we could call it a dharmic monarchy or a succession of dharmic monarchies. That would be more of a appropriate way of referencing the politics in India. But so when you call it a dharma democracy, it is particularly difficult to get a hold of. Okay, but now I want to go to the independence thinkers and the literature they generated. Okay. Um, and I'm going to share another quote here. Okay, so let me share that slide and then we will develop it further. So, the standard account of the rise of democracy draws a straight line from a prosperous urban middle class to demands for a democratic system of government. I presume they demand, because they are now prosperous, they
Mhm.
demand a democratic system of government. But this standard account glosses over an important intermediate variable, civil society. It is indeed a testament to the patient toil of India's nation builders that they were able to cultivate a society strong enough to sustain a democracy under extremely challenging conditions. And then there is another one, the right after that. I mean, it's actually in your preface. Indian independence literature is the world's most voluminous and arguably its most thoroughly introspective. It is too little read by Indians today. It deserves to be read by the world. Okay, now can you please elaborate on these two ideas for our audience?
Right. You're absolutely right that Rashtra Dharma is not an ancient concept because the idea of a nation is not an ancient concept. We don't find a sense that India is a nation in the modern sense of a group of people who should be governed under the same government who share a territory, that if you're in Bengal and you're Bengali, you have every much a right to live in Maharashtra as a Maharashtrian does, that it's your country too, right? That idea, it does not predate the independence movement. That idea starts maybe in 1857, or Savarkar wanted to make it out to start in 1857. It starts percolating. I mean, it really starts percolating from the beginning of the 19th century and gathers steam. And then by 1900, it starts to become a real idea of India as a single Rashtra with a single dharma, with a single dharma to that Rashtra, a single national sense of national duty. So it is a new idea. It's not an eternally Hindu idea. It is a modern idea in a Hindu society. And that had to create that need was there to create those connections among society, not simply being religious, but people viewing it as a national unity, not merely a religious unity. I mean, look across the Muslim world. There are 40 something Muslim countries. Uh, they all have unity of religion, they don't have national unity. A Syrian is not an Algerian. Yes, they share a brotherhood of Islam, uh, but they have a different sense of nationhood. What happened in India was the creation of a shared sense of nationhood. Now, the idea that civil society in India had to be created. It's not that India didn't have civil society before 1900 or 1920. It's that there was no India-wide civil society. There were lots of local civil societies in India that had to be knitted together. The RSS played a huge role in creating a sense of a single civil society and facilitating connections. And that's why in my chapter on the emergency, I don't credit the RSS with its with overthrowing Indira Gandhi. I think there's a lot of very self-serving RSS historiography that tries to make it out that the RSS was some kind of resistance leader. What I said, no. What the RSS did was over a at that point, it was 50-year history
Mhm.
of building connections and facilitating ties. It created the network, the civil society network. Again, it's one among many organizations. It's just the most prominent that created a civil society network so that people all over India were all talking to each other. And that in 1975, instead of India breaking up into 7 separate rebellions against Indira Gandhi, there was a there was a single civil society that cooperated across the country. Communists in India did the same thing, and this audience may not be an audience that would be sympathetic to communism. Obviously, communism is a militantly atheistic movement. However, communists in India also attempted to create national networks, to create a civil society of outside of the state and outside of these regional silos. That a communist is a communist is a communist wherever you are in India. And during the emergency, we saw that there were networks through socialist and communist circles that
Mhm.
connected across India. But primarily, it was the Hindu circles, right?
Right.
And that Hindu civil society is what made India strong enough to get through the emergency. Look, the question of democracy, I'm sorry to stray a little here, but the question of democracy is never what will a country choose for its governance. Every country in the world that was born after 1920 or so claims to be a democracy. You could say, well, Bhutan's not a democracy. It's like, yeah, but the Bhutan monarchy dates way back. Saudi Arabia is not a democracy. Yeah, but the Saudi kingdom dates from way back, and these traditions go farther back. The new countries that were born that wrote their own constitutions all wrote democratic constitutions. China, Vietnam, they have democratic constitutions. Uh, the problem isn't writing a democratic constitution. The problem is surviving that first crisis. When the founding leader steps down, or in Nehru's case, when the founding leader dies, will he pass on his power to his family and create a family dictatorship? Or will elections continue and power be broadly diffused? In India, there was a typical third world pattern. Somebody seized control of the national liberation movement. In India, that someone was Nehru. It didn't have to be. He wasn't the overwhelming leader, but he ended up in control of the reins of power, and he held on to them, never let go. He ultimately transferred that power to his daughter, not directly, but Indira Gandhi never would have become prime minister had she not been the daughter of Jawaharlal Nehru. And then India hit a crisis where the founding family said, okay, we're now a dictatorship. It's our country.
Right.
Okay. The question is, why did India survive that crisis
Right.
when so many other democracies failed that crisis?
Right.
And in India, again, I put it down to the strength of Hindu civil society.
Actually, Salvatore, in the book, at some point in the book, you actually raise a question and leave it open-ended. You almost say nobody knows why Indira Gandhi relinquished power and called for fresh elections, and then she lost the elections, right? And that is in a certain sense, that is a defining moment
Yeah.
in the history of India's democracy, right? Now, I mean, the RSS um, may take some credit for organizing resistance to
Yeah.
the emergency and the the kind of autocratic impulses that were unleashed during the period of the emergency. But they certainly had nothing to do with Indira Gandhi all of a
No.
sudden voluntarily declaring fresh elections and then going on to lose the elections. Okay. Now, I mean, I have a little bit of insight about what really happened, and I don't know if it's worth it. I will offer this to you. Have you heard of a philosopher in India by the name J. Krishnamurti?
No, I'm
J.
sorry.
Krishnamurti. Okay, great. So he was a remarkable figure, a philosopher, and really an extraordinary sort of a mystic philosopher. Okay, he wouldn't call himself a Hindu, but he was sort of beyond labels and so on. And there was an occasion when Indira Gandhi actually went and visited him and stayed with him for a couple of days in his ashram in uh, someplace in Andhra Pradesh. And in that meeting, they have a long discussion, the two of them, about what to do, what should Indira Gandhi do going forward. And he actually recounts in his own diaries, which I've read, where he says he told her, "You're sitting on the back of a tiger. It is going to swallow you. You have to find a way of getting off the back of the tiger and letting go. If the people want you, they will elect you back into power." And that was one of the conversations that is recounted in his diaries. And it had something to do with her relinquishing power. It's certainly not the RSS per se, even though they did resist the emergency phenomenon. But I want to go to another point here. Most of the other countries which reached this point, where the founding family of the new country arrived at a point where they were not popular anymore, but they were not willing to relinquish power. They ended up holding on to power using all sorts of oppressive mechanisms and tactics and so on. So, typically, what is how does that unfold in other countries which could have been a democracy, but they did not? They didn't survive as democracies. What happened with them?
Look, the typical pattern is one of two outcomes, which is either that the party wins.
Hmm.
So the party in power, the person in power is able through the power of their political party to retain the control of government, and you get a one-party state, or the military steps in,
Hmm.
and a general or a colonel or a general becomes the new dictator. Either way, it's a pathway towards dictatorship, either a party dictatorship or a military dictatorship. And you can see that, again, all you have to do is look to Pakistan, Pakistan becoming a military dictatorship, Bangladesh becoming, in effect, a party dictatorship. Right? And these two routes to resolution. But on the question of why Indira Gandhi gave up the reins of power,
Hmm.
it's hard to say. Everybody differs. Everybody has a story about someone she talked to who
Yeah.
talked her out of it.
Mhm.
One historian simply said she held the elections because she thought she would win.
Yeah.
But I want to remind everybody that India's emergency was conducted in accordance with India's constitution. Like most continental European constitutions, the Indian Constitution had a mechanism for declaring a state of emergency. It had mechanisms for handling state of emergency. A state of emergency can't go on forever. And the question was, well, what's she going to do to end this state of emergency at some point? She was having increasing non-cooperation from all segments of society, including the military. The military did not, the Indian Armed Forces in no way attempted to seize power, but they refused to cooperate with anything extra constitutional. So any request of Indira Gandhi's that went against the Constitution, they simply refused. They said, no, the Constitution says we have to do this. Okay,
Hmm.
so the increasing levels of non-cooperation with her government had to be resolved one way or another. And probably the simplest explanation is she thought she'd win the election. She held it under circumstances that strongly tilted the playing field in her favor.
Mhm.
Most of the opposition was in prison. And so she, you know, gave it a spin and gave it a shot. But whatever the reason for her
Mhm.
calling the election, I mean, she didn't just step down. She called an election hoping to win a renewed mandate, clearly. Um, you know, India pulled through it. But again, she never would have had to hold an election if there hadn't been a strong civil society maintaining continual pressure on her, continual protest against it, non-cooperation with her policies.
Mhm.
And I mean, remember, she's a daughter of the independence movement. She may also have felt a sense I mean, she clearly felt a sense of duty to India. I mean, no one would accuse Indira Gandhi of not being patriotic. Uh, Maybe that sense of duty to her own country, her own sense of Rashtra Dharma, may have convinced her that, you know what, she has to find a peaceful way out of this.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm not a political psychologist, and I've never met the woman.
Sure, sure, absolutely.
But
We're guessing. All of us are guessing. Yeah. So let's go back to this your assessment of the independence literature of India. Okay. So clearly, your investigation of the question, why did democracy survive in India when the odds were against that happening, somehow led you into studying the independence literature. And I assume that's how you ended up looking at the writings of all of those different people who participated in.
not
Mm,
not not quite. So the reason this book took me so long was
mm,
I discovered very early
mm,
that I couldn't trust anybody on questions of Indian democracy.
mm,
There were the establishment historians who were telling a clearly false narrative. I mean, I started obviously with the establishment historians. Everyone told me, go read Ramachandra Guha and India after Gandhi. And so I went to the establishment historians. The stories were clearly um, fabricated.
mm,
And so then I started going to the anti-establishment historians, the RSS historians, such and their stories, while they had a greater ring of truth in a way, I mean,
mm,
particularly influential. Maybe some of your audience will know him, Ratan Sharda,
yeah.
who's a BJP historian in Mumbai. Uh, his work had a ring of truth to it. I trusted him more,
Mhm,
but again, it was clearly highly political. He
mhm,
had his side of the story to tell.
mhm, mhm.
I got to the eminent historians. I'm blanking on his name.
Arun Shourie? Arun
Arun
Shourie?
Shuri, sorry, thank you. Arun Shuri, read his work, and I thought, oh, this is really funny, reading his work. And so I
Yeah.
finally realized, look, I have to go back and read it myself.
Okay.
Right? I can't take any of these accounts of Indian history at face value. And so I
Mm,
started going back and reading period literature. I
mm,
wanted to know about partition. Instead of reading books about partition,
mhm,
I read the books of partition. So Rajendra Prasad wrote a book on partition. Nehru's Discovery of India, half of it's devoted to partition. Ambedkar wrote a book on Pakistan and then revised it into a book on partition 5 years later. There is a whole Muslim literature associated with Aligarh Muslim University on Pakistan and the need, or as they saw it, the desire for the partition of India. So, going back to the original sources and seeing what they had to say. And of course, that ultimately leads you back to the foundational sources of Indian nationhood. The Lal Bal Pal sources and Rabindranath Tagore and Sri Aurobindo. I personally found a kind of resonance with Bipin Chandra Pal, who I think is um, vastly underread.
mm,
But his ideas are not fashionable. I mean, if you go read him, I know he's an icon. If you go read him on Nationality and Empire, he's advocating the British Empire.
mm,
Right? He's not advocating an immediate independence for India. So, going back and reading the original sources, and of course, Swami Vivekananda. I mean, I can't say that often enough. Although he's not explicitly writing about nationhood, the important thing about Swami Vivekananda is he's speaking to ordinary people
yeah,
as well as speaking to intellectuals. And he's one of the few people who can, I mean, I'm not a good public speaker for a broad public audience. I love talking to a highly motivated intellectual audience like the Hindu University of America audience. Vivekananda could talk to this audience,
mhm,
and he could also talk to the illiterate man in the street.
mm,
And that's why I think he played such an important role, is that he talked to everybody. And so going back and reading the original sources was just fascinating. And not just the sources. I read the Times of India from the period, because if you want to know what was happening, the history book is always telling you its own viewpoint. If you get the news as it was written that day,
mhm,
you get a very different perspective. So the key role, for example, in Hindu-Muslim relations in India, the the Mapilla revolt or the Mopla uprising in
mm. Kerala.
in Kerala and well, I don't know what state it was in at the time, but
Mhm,
in the southwest of India, that was a formative aspect of India. The Khilafat movement was a formative aspect. I mean, Gandhi's involvement in the Khilafat or Caliphate movement shaped the Congress Party on the trajectory it's going to have for the next 25 years through to independence. Uh, all of this is vastly misrepresented
Mhm.
in the secondary literature, in the historical literature. If you go to the period sources, you get a whole different story of how India developed from
That's
British
right.
colonialism into independence. And I think that's the period you have to focus on, because if you want to know why India became a democracy, um, the answer is not to be found in the works of 1995. The answer is to be found in the works of 1925.
Right.
Right? Who set
Yeah.
India on that course?
Yeah, terrific. So, so you say that it is not being read enough by Indians or Hindus today,
Yeah.
and you're also saying the world must read it, and that's a pretty extraordinary observation. Why do you believe that the world must read it?
Look, the world has to read it because the U.S. I'm an American, and as inspiring as the American independence literature is, I doubt it's very inspiring for a highly religious subsistence farmer in Somalia, right? It's inspiring for an individualist. Now,
Mm,
I'm an individualist. I find it inspiring, but the typical farmer in Africa or the Middle East, or the typical tradesperson, someone who runs a, a cloth shop in Cairo. Again, Alexander Hamilton's not going to inspire this person.
mm,
What the world needs is a democracy literature that's accessible to them,
mm,
ideas that are accessible to them. So the idea that you should put your nation above all else, that all of your co-nationals are your brothers. Well,
mm,
that's an important part of democracy. You don't have democracy unless everybody feels united as a nation. Or take the question of language. I think it was Tagore who wrote on. No, I'm getting the reference wrong. Who wrote on English language education.
mm,
And well, that's something that is something India is still dealing with today, that people all over the world should deal with. Should countries educate their own people in English for global success, or should they educate their own people in their national language for
mhm,
national success? Well, this is a question that was raised in India in the 1920s.
mhm,
And India's independence leaders wrote about it. The relation between your obligations your um, your family, your nation, and to the world.
mhm,
Uh, Again, Sri Aurobindo on Asiatic democracy. This was his fundamental theme and the theme comes straight, parenthetically, from Mazzini, the theme that you have to serve the world through your nation, right?
mhm,
So not through Islam, not through your Hindu faith. You're serving the world through your membership in the nation. Again, that's a great message for building a nation on. Now, you may disagree with that message, but if you want to build a nation where people accept that they're all part of a shared community of destiny, the Indian literature is far more accessible
mm.
than the American literature.
No, no. I mean, that's not an observation that Hindus would have made, obviously, particularly because they're not reading all of this literature very much nowadays. But it sounds like you've been through an extraordinary journey of discovery here, just discovering the Indian independence literature, for example, right?
It's been fantastic. I've loved it. It's been an incredible education. It's
Mm,
something I've truly enjoyed. It's been a lot of fun, learning so much. I mean, people think of scholars as people who want to talk at them, like want to lecture. The idea is that, oh, I'm a professor. I want to go lecture to people and tell them what I know and what I think. It's like, no, no. Scholarship is learning what other people
mhm.
think. I mean, the real pleasure for me is getting to read.
Yeah,
Spending months, years, reading these fascinating books that people are just ignoring.
yeah.
I wish I could not have to write and
Mhm.
just have my whole life to
about
read
reading.
these things. It's an incredible education,
Yeah,
and I truly enjoyed it.
yeah. So I'm gonna take you to another distinction. We're gonna go over a little bit, okay, everybody, please, because this is so interesting. So, in one section, you make a distinction which I had not heard about until I read it in your book, okay?
Yeah,
And that is this comprador elites versus national elites,
yeah,
okay? And you're saying the social division between the comprador and the national elites is not highlighted in standard histories of India, but it is visible to anyone who has an eye to look for it. The widely held idea that nationalism is a threat to democracy, today a basic assumption of informed political commentary, flies in the face of history. It might more accurately be said that nationalism is a necessary, though not sufficient, condition for democracy. And I have two questions from this quotation. The first is, help us understand comprador elite and national elite a little more. Okay, that's the first one.
yeah,
And then the second one is, obviously, why is, as soon as the word nationalism is brought up, it seems like the Western scholars
yeah.
have such a negative view about it. And it's very strange to us because we don't think of nationalism as such a negative. Of course, German nationalism had its problems in Germany during the period leading up to the World Wars One and Two. Yes, but that's not an indictment of nationalism everywhere else. It's an indictment of what happened in Germany. So we don't understand why. What is the root cause for this extremely negative view about nationalism as somehow inimical to democracy? So please, those two questions.
And what's funny even about that example is everyone loves Polish nationalism that they stood up to the Germans. So, which is nationalism good or bad? It's neither good nor bad.
Yeah.
Some nations do good things, some nations do bad things, but it's not nationalism itself that is good or bad. Look, the term comprador comes from, uh, like actually the word caste, interestingly, it comes from the Portuguese. A
Mhm.
comprador is simply a buyer. Now, when the Portuguese arrived in India, they wanted to buy lots of things from India, but they didn't speak the languages, they didn't have the local connections, and so they worked through local Indians called compradors. The same language was used by the Portuguese in Macau, and later it was adopted by the British in Hong Kong. That a comprador is the local buyer who works with the colonist. Right? The
Mhm.
colonist doesn't have the connections in the community, so must work through a local person who does have those connections. Now, it came to mean something more broadly, which is people who facilitated the governance of colonialism. So you can't run, the British could not have run India without Indians to run India for them. And when you look across the major figures of
So
India's
who
independence,
aligned with the colonists, the colonizers?
look, whether they supported or hated the colonizers. I mean,
They
Subhash Chandra
facilitated.
Bose, no one would say that he loved the British, but he was British educated. He wrote in English, right? He could interact with the British.
Mhm.
And that's the point. There's a class of people who are intermediaries between the colonizers and the colonized. It doesn't mean that they're doing the will of the colonizer. It's not a dirty word, comprador, but it does mean it's a person who's facilitating. And so if we look across India's independence movement, um, Gandhi, of course, British barrister. Nehru, British barrister. Jinnah, British barrister. Ambedkar, Columbia University American lawyer, right? So a little different. You then did a master's in England. Savarkar, he would have been a British barrister if they'd let him take the exam, and they refused to let him take the exam. But he trained as a British barrister. And you can go across one after another, all of these British barristers who are able to work through the law courts to intermediate between British rule and Indian subjects. Now, that doesn't always mean they're working for the British, of course, with the early Congress movement. And remember, I mean, Indians know this, but they have to always be reminded about this. The Congress movement pre 1947 is not the Congress Party of 2025. So when I say the Congress, I always get these boos and hisses. And it's like, no, the Congress was working in their own view of their own idea of what would be good for India. And not just Congress, but all of the major figures of the independence movement, almost all, were English educated British barristers. They were compradors. They were able to represent the British to Indians, and they were able to represent Indians to the British. I mean, if someone had to go meet the viceroy, well, it had to be somebody who spoke English, who knew the forms of address, who knew how to play British politics, who understood how British government works. It had to be a comprador representing Indians to the British. That's the comprador elite. But there was also, India was large enough and prosperous enough. There was also a national elite in India that was not part of that comprador elite. And the clearest example of this, and we've talked about it before, is the RSS. KB Hedgewar was a doctor, right? He was now he's elite. He's very highly educated, but he was educated in India. His connections were in India. He never went to London and developed connections with British parliamentarians. His connections were Indian connections. Guruji, Golwalkar, was again highly educated biologist who then got a law degree. But again, his biology degree, his law degree were all Indian. His connections were Indian. Even for that matter, Swami Vivekananda, although he went to the West as an Indian guru, not as a so not to get his education in America. He went to America to educate Americans, right, about India, and his connections were Indian. He's a member of the Indian elite, and there's a whole class in India of people who are prosperous, well-to-do, highly educated in their own languages and in their own milieu. They form the national as opposed to the comprador, or you could call it the internationalist elite. These are people who've never left India or rarely left India in their entire lives. These two basic groups in India continue through to today and form the basic conflict between the BJP and the INC. In that the BJP, I mean, we're not going to call the BJP leadership, they're elites, right? There's no, I mean, I know that, Narendra Modi arose from the masses to become an elite. But if you look across the BJP and its supporters and its funders, and if you look at the, whether it's the Adanis and the Ambanis, they're all elites, but they're indigenous homegrown elites, as opposed to the Congress Party is dominated by internationalist elites, people who got their education abroad, people who are highly fluent in English. And the way I put it to people as a sociologist, the one way I'm trying to make this very clear is if I imagine running into somebody at a cocktail party in Manhattan, could I run into Rahul Gandhi? Certainly. Could I run into Shashi Tharoor? Certainly. Could I run into Mohan Bhagwat? Inconceivable. Right? It's completely. Would Amit Shah be welcome at this cocktail party in Manhattan? I mean, he might get in because of his political connections, but he wouldn't be invited, right? He's not someone who would socially intermingle. Now, Mohan Bhagwat and Amit Shah are elites, but they're national elites within India. They are not global or internationalized elites. And that sociological distinction pervades the independence movement. It's very clear, on August 15th, 1947, on the Day of Independence. I use the example of the speeches given on the eve of independence and these elites speaking in English on the eve of independence. And it carries through to today. This division is incredibly important for understanding the evolution of Indian democracy and why the international press and the international non-governmental organizations have now condemned Indian democracy. They've condemned it because India is being run by people today who are not of their social class. The head of Human Rights Watch might very well know Rahul Gandhi socially, The head of Human Rights Watch does not know Narendra Modi socially. He only knows Narendra Modi as the Prime Minister of India. And that social gulf drives a lot of the challenges India is facing in its global reputation.
So, so this correlates with the problem of Wiedem's assessment. So if
Yeah.
we take a look at this institute, Varieties of Democracy Institute, and they basically are making a case against India and its descent into fascism, right? They call out deterioration of freedom of expression, compromising the independence of the media, harassment of journalists critical of the government, attacks on civil society, silencing dissent in academia, undermining the constitution's commitment to secularism, it's etc. And it's almost like a polemical, diatribe against India as a democracy, right? So, and you very rightly point out that what can we do? They keep assessing
Well,
India's democracy like this.
well, let me can I interrupt right there?
Yeah, please. Yeah.
They're not assessing Indian democracy.
Mhm.
Indian elites are assessing Indian democracy
Right.
using VDEM as a platform.
Right.
And thus my notorious phrase that if anyone knows me, I said India's intellectuals are anti-India. That was not meant to be a soundbite. That was meant to be an explanation that the VDEM rankings are not Sweden's rankings of India. They are Indian intellectuals ranking of India. But
Mhm.
who does VDEM imagine? A Swedish, fundamentally European. I mean, it's a pan-European institute. But it's run in Sweden. A European democracy rating institute has to reach out to Indians to get its evaluation of freedom of expression in India. Who's it going to reach out to? That comprador elite or that national elite? Are they going to reach out to somebody who runs an independent English language media website? Or are they going to reach out to someone who edits a Hindi paper in a second tier city in India? Um, Obviously, like the person who runs a relatively obscure, low readership English language website is likely to be in their pool of potential experts. The person who runs a local newspaper in Lucknow with 500,000 readers is not going to be in their database. And that's why the ratings end up being so negative, because the comprador class in India is dead set against the current government of India, and more broadly, is distrustful of Indian institutions in general. I mean, India's rankings on VDEM are low-ish for the pre-Modi era. They're terrible for the Modi era, but even for the pre-Modi era, they're mediocre. And I think it's because the kinds of people who would be likely to be informants, and not just for VDEM,
Mhm.
kind of people who would likely to be informants for the World Press Freedom Index, which is run by the activist group Reporters Sans Frontières. Again, if you're a local Telugu journalist or a local Tamil journalist, are you going to go to Reporters Without Borders to make your complaint? No, you're going to go to the press council to make your complaint because you're embedded in local networks. You're not embedded in these global networks. And
So
so
if is VDM taking note of your observations, or they don't care at the moment? They think they know their methodology works perfectly and they can
no,
kind of
I'm beneath the dignity, but I want to be fair. I have not reached out to them specifically.
Mhm.
Uh, um, I'm a busy person. I should have, like in the scheme of things, should I have written a letter to VDEM saying, "Look, I'm finding these challenges in your index." Yeah, I admit it's a personal failing that I did not take the time to write to them. My prior experience of my colleagues in the academic world suggests that such a letter would be a worthless gesture. Uh, but occasionally I'm asked, have I written? No, I haven't written to them, but they're very well aware, I'm sure, of what I've written. I mean, it's been very
Yeah.
prominently cited. And, I think look, they are, I don't blame the people at VDEM. They are highly invested in a methodology that I believe is flawed at its very core.
Yeah.
Uh,
And that's kind of
But
shocking, isn't it? I mean, they not able to even uh, self-reflect this much to
well,
recognize that the methodology is flawed?
the problem is that it would require throwing out 20 years of research and and not billions, tens of millions of dollars in grant funding. It's just not going to happen. They have a methodology, they're committed to it. And it's not just about the informants that's the problem. Even the structure of their rankings is
In
very
fact,
technical.
let me put it this way, right? I mean, your analysis of the structure of the rankings, the methodology that VDEM
Yeah.
uses for doing their work is probably one of its kind. I don't think anybody else has done this kind of analysis on their methodology.
No,
Pretty,
look, and it reflects where I come from, in that my own expertise is on rankings. My expertise is not on India. So
Mhm.
I came to India as someone who has a methodological expertise in international rankings. I wrote a book on methods for quantitative macro comparative research about 10 years ago. I mean, it's what I did for the first 15 years of my academic career was focus on international statistics. I still teach statistics at the University of Sydney. I have a master's in applied mathematics. I am a statistician
Mhm.
looking at the looking at India, not an Indian expert looking at the rankings. And as a result, the problems with the rankings, I mean, you just open the page and they're immediately apparent. The rankings were driven by political scientists who I believe did not really understand statistics very well, and they hired a statistician to do the stats. And the problem there is that they got some extraordinarily sophisticated statistics. The head of VDEM, Stefan Lindbergh, actually calls it. I think he calls it not even rocket science. He calls it uh, astronomical quality statistics. I forget his exact phrase. It's in the book, because he doesn't actually know how these statistics work. They're incredibly sophisticated methods that they use that just have very poor design. And this is a problem that I've seen, that you see across the social and medical sciences. A medical scientist commissions a study. They know the medicine, but they don't know the statistics, and so they get statistics that don't really suit their problem. And this is exactly the same thing. They had a theoretical model of how democracy works. They had five main components of democracy. Do you have uh, do you have elected officials? Are the officials elected with universal suffrage? Are the elections run fairly? Can people organize political parties and opposition? And can people speak freely? And those five components are perfectly reasonable, but they analyze each in isolation so that China, for example, gets a perfect score for having elected officials. Vietnam gets a perfect score for having
But
Vietnam.
wouldn't they notice that there is a problem? I mean, when they rate China above India, for example, in a
Well, they
democratic,
don't actually rate China above India. They put China and
they
India in the
don't.
same category. But the ridiculous thing of it lacks a substantive validity. But in their minds, well, let me use Vietnam. It's an even worse example. Vietnam gets a perfect score for elected officials and a perfect score for universal suffrage. Everyone's allowed to vote in Vietnam, and a very good score for the quality of its elections because the elections are well run. Nowhere here does it acknowledge that only one candidate can run. It's a communist dictatorship. The only place in VDEM where you get to the problem is there's one indicator that is, can you form opposition political parties? And Vietnam gets a zero for that. Yeah, but that little indicator is not one indicator. That's the heart of democracy, right? If you can't form alternate political parties, is it a democracy at all? And the problem was they laid out this theoretical framework that sounded good, right? You have to have all these things to have a democracy. And so if you multiply one by the other, by the other, by the other, but then they realized if you multiplied them all together, if you're missing just one thing, you get a zero. And so they said, all right, well, that's too much. So we'll have a multiplicative component where you multiply them all together. And then we'll have an additive component where we add your score on each of these five things. And then we'll take the average of your multiplicative score and your additive score. And there's no real theoretical basis for that. They just thought, well, that sort of works. Now, Sanjeev Sanyal has done good work in pointing out the more minor discrepancies in VDEM. For example, having an unelected head of state doesn't count against you at all in VDEM. Why? Because Sweden has an unelected head of state.
Mm.
England has an unelected head of state. Denmark has an unelected, Norway. And so they never thought, does that make you undemocratic, having an unelected head of state? It didn't enter their minds because they're sure they're democratic. So there are some cultural problems with VDEM being very European oriented, Northern European oriented, but those are minor compared to these serious statistical problems with VDEM. And if anyone doesn't want to read the whole book, I mean, it's all
Yeah.
detailed in the book, but there's also, I did a paper on VDEM. You can find it on the Indian Century Roundtable website that goes through the methodological shortcomings in greater details. It's just a really badly designed system. But at its heart, not only is it badly designed statistically, but I want to get back to the theoretical issue. It's all VDEM and even all of the other democracy and rule of law indices that are not VDEM, they almost all focus on Indian informants to tell them about India and Nigerian informants to tell them about Nigeria and about people who are in-country experts. And who is likely to be an in-country expert? A member of that comprador class.
So that's a very important distinction. I mean, I particularly took note of the distinction between the comprador elites and the national elites, which was probably not, in our language before the book. So, we're going to close the webinar shortly, but Salvatore, one final question for you. Obviously, you've taken a stance about Indian democracy that is at odds with the so-called mainstream consensus. How has that affected you personally? I mean, have you faced any reactions from the mainstream academia? I mean, what has been happening in this regard?
Look, I've faced, as with much of my work, I've faced ostracism from the academy, but I accepted 10 or 15 years ago that I'd rather be ostracized by the academy than do conventional research. Every research project I've taken up in the last 10 or 15 years has been challenging the existing consensus. And I guess that goes all the way back to around 2010. I started working on the Chinese economy. And I'm going to give this little story because it just is illustrative. It has nothing to do with India. Well, it does actually, but tangentially. I had an article on the cover of Foreign Affairs magazine in 2011. It was called Middling Kingdom, that China's growth would stall by 2020. The Chinese Communist Party were not incredible economic managers, that China would never catch up with the US and Europe, that it was, simply bouncing back from a century of economic repression. And by 2020, that would play itself out and China would level off and stop growing. The other article they paired it with, the other cover article on that month, was by I can't believe Arvind Subramanian, who later became chief economic advisor of India. Right? He said, no, China's going to grow. It's going to overtake Europe in GDP per capita by 2035, overtake America by 2045. And at that point, China will have GDP per capita higher than the United States with 4 times the population. And China will completely rule the world. It'll be 4 times the size, the economy of China, 4 times the size of the American economy. Now, we both wrote our articles. I'm still an associate professor. I didn't even get my chair at the University of Sydney. He became chief economic advisor of India. Now, I'm confident I won that debate. But I took a heterodox view that was a based on what I viewed as an unbiased application of general principles that we all accept about how development economics works to the Chinese case, instead of taking the popular view, which was rah rah China. And the same with it. So, that I was marginalized for that. I've been marginalized for the work on India. That doesn't affect me much. I have a tenured position at the University of Sydney. I'm not going anywhere. My pay is secure. The only problem is if you continually challenge, yeah, you don't get that professorial chair. For that matter, the book, look, I'm thrilled with Connor Court. Connor Court published the book. Connor Court is a local Australian political publisher. I couldn't get the book published with an academic press.
Yeah.
I had to go to a commercial press because, and Concorde's perfectly reputable, but it's a local Australian reputable press. It's not Princeton University Press, or Stanford University Press. But the problem was that by challenging the academic orthodoxy, you are excluded from the highest profile academic venues. And
The peer review process doesn't allow you to get through, right?
it's a serious problem. But again, I mean, I have a job, I have a career. No one has to worry that I'm going to be in the streets starving or something like that. And look, and I have a lot more fun. It's great. The whole purpose to me of an academic post, you're given a job for life, insulated by academic freedom from any concerns about people disliking your viewpoint. That should be used. You're given this ivory tower, seat in the ivory tower. Um, you should use it to be really open-minded, to completely just to say, look, I have the leisure and the support to do what I think is to search for the truth as I see it,
Mhm.
instead of being a careerist. Why be a careerist when all it'll get you is an extra, $20,000 or something like that? It's not going to change your life
Yeah.
to be a careerist, but people want to climb that ladder, and I, I always say, why didn't you go in the private sector then? You'd make much more money.
Yeah. Yeah.
Are we
Right.
going to be able to take questions, or is
I,
that
I
not part of
think
this?
I think we've gone for almost an hour and a half. I know there are a lot of questions in the
It's up
box.
to you. I'm
Uh, I,
free
I
if you have.
I'd like to maybe, if you want, Salvatore, you can take a few minutes, take the questions from the audience. Okay, you open the QA box in the. Can you see the QA box?
In the chat, or no
Not
more
in the
QA?
chat. Go to
Yep,
the
I see the QA. Yep.
Yeah, so you can take the questions one by one and go through your responses for them. Okay, and let me just by way of completing the formal part of the webinar, I would encourage all of the members of the audience to buy his book, Dharma Democracy. So I enjoy reading that book. It's an easy read. It's not one of those dense academic type reads, but it's a wonderful exploration. And I think you learned, I learned something new from the book, and I'm sure everybody will. So, Salvatore, over to you. You can take the
Yeah.
questions one.
The 2000 book is Democracy and Development by Adam Przeworski. Przeworski is a Polish name, so impossible to say or spell in English, but nonetheless, Democracy and Development, published in the year 2000, is the name of the book. Uh, the Is democracy overrated? No, I don't think so. So China has done People think China's done very well from a totalitarian model, but I don't think China is going to reach its full potential as a result. So if you look at Taiwan, which originated as a relatively poor province of China, Taiwan is now what, 4 times as rich as China. So I don't think that China's totalitarianism is responsible for its growth. In fact, I think China's totalitarianism prevented it from growing until 1980, when it finally got a leader who said, "Yeah, let's get rich first and then worry about things." He lifted the lid on the Chinese economy. China grew rapidly simply because the government didn't interfere. And now that the government is back to interfering, China's economy has stalled, and I think India will escape that as India is growing, but it won't run into that crisis of control that China has. Uh, how did Hinduism survive? Well, all these other colonized countries turned Christian. Look, the gap between there was not a fundamental technological gap between the colonizer and the colonized during the period of colonization of India. That's true both for what now many people are starting to call Muslim colonization in India. Uh, that is, technology levels were relatively similar, and Western colonization. The primary advantage that the Portuguese and later the English had was an advantage in seaborne trade, but not particularly in technology broadly. Even when Western technology started to increase during the Industrial Revolution, that wasn't really until the early 19th century. By then, India had already been colonized. So, India was colonized during a period when there was not a major technological gap, and there was access to European technologies. So, of course, the Sikhs gave the British a run for their money. With a modern army fighting against the British in the 19th century. With the Americas, it was very different. I mean, and in Australia, hunter-gatherer societies fighting against an advanced European military. Same in Africa. Uh, the rights of citizenry in the Ramayana, I have to admit, I'm not an expert on the Ramayana. I've heard a lot about the Lichavi Republic. I'm not saying that these things didn't exist in ancient India. Um, Ancient India, by all accounts, had the same kind of institutions as ancient Greece. And whether you believe in Aryan invasion or you hate the Aryan invasion theory, whichever way you put it, Greek and Sanskrit are very closely related languages, and the Greek people, and we know there was a Greek invasion, that is, the Aryans invaded Greece. We have historical evidence for that around 1200 BC. Before that, Greece was not Greek. So whatever the connection is, there's clearly a strong connection between ancient Greek and ancient Indian culture. Ancient Greece had democratic republics. Ancient India had democratic republics. But just as Western democracy is not in any way connected to ancient Athens, modern Indian democracy is not in any way connected to the ancient Indian republics. Yes, it's there as a trove of language and a trove of tradition to pull on. But if you go back and read the Indian independence era works, there's no mention made, or only the most broad cultural references made to any potential for democracy coming from ancient India. Modern Indian democracy was created by modern Indians. And same thing is true for Western democracy. It is not connected in any way to ancient Athens. Ancient Athens just gives us a set of language to use about it, but the institutions are not connected. Look, Desai Deepak, and I'm sorry, people find this very unpopular. I'm not a fan. There's nothing wrong factually with Desai Deepak's work. He's a very professional lawyer. The problem is that he's a lawyer, and he's using social science in India, that is Bharat. He uses social science clearly in ways for which it was not intended, but that as a lawyer, you could say, this person literally wrote this. And in the law, you're responsible for exactly precisely what you wrote, and this could be applied to India. So Desai Deepak's fundamental thesis is that Hindus are the indigenous peoples of India and thus deserve protections under the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and should be treated as an indigenous people under occupation somehow. And look, the simple fact is Hindus run India today. Narendra Modi is not an occupying force against which Hindus are poor indigenous people struggling for recognition. Hindus run India, and it's just the reality. We could, in a lawyerly sense, make an argument that Hindus are still a colonized indigenous people, but I just don't think that makes any substantive sense. Why are the establishment histories and anti-establishment histories not quite accurate? It's not that they're not accurate, it's that they're incredibly biased. And even the accuracy runs into problems of lack of citation. So I would repeatedly hear, Gandhi said such and such. And it's like, did Gandhi say that? And I would go to the collected works of Mahatma Gandhi, have trouble finding it. I would try to trace things down. Very often, trails of citations would just end in a blank at some point. One that I actually use in the book that I found the ultimate answer to, India will be divided or India will be destroyed. Muhammad Ali Jinnah. No, it wasn't Muhammad Ali Jinnah. Now, it represents the ideas of Muhammad Ali Jinnah, perhaps, but I actually found the article in the Times of India where the actual person who said it is correctly cited in the Times of India. And then if you keep reading the article, there's a photo of Muhammad Ali Jinnah because the article also talks about the Muslim League meeting at which Jinnah was speaking. So he didn't actually say it, yet dozens of history books simply cited as, oh, Jinnah said this at the beginning of Direct Action Day. While I'm on Direct Action Day, similarly, a lot of the history of partition focuses on Punjab, and rightly so. There's terrible violence in Punjab, but it all really started in Bengal and with Direct Action Day. And Direct Action Day is severely uh, underplayed in histories of India, and that's changing now. Vivek Agnihotri has a new documentary out that I'm looking forward to seeing when it comes to Sydney in a couple weeks about the history of partition and the violence in Bengal. So, like a lot of these emphases are just not there, and you have to go to original sources to get the fuller picture. Which is to say, I have to become an amateur historian. Um, the so Chris agrees that democracy in India is because of Hindu dharmic philosophy, and I'm very sorry to disappoint. That's not my argument. It's not it's not the content of Hindu faith that has made India a democracy. It's the structure of Hindu faith that has made India a democracy. I use the word dharma because it is the Hindu word for duty, uh, but it's not the Hindu-ness of India that makes it a democracy. It's the way Hindus interact that supports Indian democracy. At least that's the argument of my book. Read the book, make your own decision. Maybe I'm wrong. Duty to the nation. So I don't discuss in the book. I don't discuss the language divisions except once. I mean, I mentioned that they exist. So the linguistic nationalism in India does exist. It is divisive in India. Notice that it tends to be anti-Hindu. And so I talk about Hindu faith being the uniting element in Indian democracy. Regional linguistic separatism, yes, is a dividing factor, as is caste is a dividing factor. So something is completely misunderstood in the West. Hindu reformers have consistently worked to eliminate caste hierarchies and convince Hindus to be Hindus regardless, or to be Indians regardless of their caste, to look beyond caste differences. Caste-based parties, of course, are divisive. They militate against that. Now, in India, you have the Mandir versus Mandal rhetoric, but nobody in the West would have any idea what Mandir or Mandal mean. So that distinction is lost in the West. So yes, there are divisive forces in India, of course. The question is, what has kept India together despite those divisive forces? How does VDEM communicate with countries where they don't speak English? Look, VDEM does not speak to countries. VDEM produces reports in English, not even in Swedish, despite being in Sweden. And that may be emblematic that if you think about it, the VDEM organizers are themselves members of a comprador elite, or at least an internationalized elite in Sweden. They don't produce reports in Swedish. They produce reports in English for a global audience, and they don't really. They're not really speaking to the peoples of countries that they consider non-democratic. They're speaking to Western elites judging countries that they consider non-democratic. Vijay asks, are VDEM agenda driven? Honestly, I don't think so. It's of course hard to tell. I don't have access, to talk to them personally, but the work does not seem agenda driven. It seems to be a genuine effort by people who are only human, have their own human biases, to implement a measure of democracy. And it's widely endorsed across the entire political science profession. There are a couple of people who've criticized VDEM, but only a couple. It's broadly been accepted. And I think it's been broadly accepted because it's being accepted by political scientists, not people, and the political scientists have not really deeply delved into its methodology to think about what the problems are. So I think the methodology is highly flawed, but most of the people who promote VDEM don't have the statistical knowledge I suspect many people who run VDEM don't have the statistical knowledge to actually question it. And those who do tend to be statisticians, not social statisticians. I want to be clear: VDEM does all of its statistics correctly. It's just doing them based on a what I think is a crazy methodology, but that's a whole different issue. Okay, I don't know what John Kennedy has to do here. That's not really a question. Uh, American democracy, absolutely. The idea that America is divided, and I've been hearing this my whole life. America is more divided than it's ever been before. It's just a bunch of rhetoric. I mean, if you want to know when America was more divided than ever before, go back to the 1960s. I mean, that was an era of serious division in America. Huge scale riots in America, riots at the Democratic National Conventions in 1964 and 1968. I mean, America is nowhere near the kinds of divisions that were tearing it apart during the Civil Rights Movement. But there's a very strong sense of agreed national identity in America. Whatever you may hear from a few intellectuals who say, Rosie O'Donnell may leave America to go live in Ireland, but they're crazy. Most Americans are fully on board with their sense of national unity. Kennedy, think not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. Yes, there is a sense of duty in the West, but it is not the primary narrative. When Mazzini wrote the Duties of Man, he was rebelling against the primary narrative, which was the rights of man. We don't talk about duties much in the West, and when we do, it's considered quaint, old-fashioned. Certainly, major intellectuals, political scientists, university scholars don't really talk about duty very much. They talk much more about rights. The middle person between India and Britain is a comprador, Comprador, sometimes compradore with an E on the end. Is Dharma the same as marriage? Look, Dharma means many things. I am not a Sanskrit scholar. I'm not going to try to define Dharma. I simply say that for the purpose of this book, Dharma is duty. That's close enough, right, for the purposes of the book. What are views about Modi and Hindutva? Look, Modi is a politician. He's a very successful politician. He's governed India as a conventional politician. The BJP and the RSS define Hindutva, and they have ever since the 1920s defined Hindutva as Indianness, not as Hindu-ness, with the rhetoric that what India is a historically Hindu land, and that the very language, for instance, Hindustan, to describe India. If I look at the most secular paper in India, it's called The Hindu. By the Hindu, they don't mean the Sanatan Dharma person. By the Hindu, they mean the Indian. Right. So there's that language. Now, Modi clearly is not an Islamophile. There's no doubt about that. And in the book, I really focus on the creation of India as a Hindu nation, not a Hindu state, a Hindu nation created social exclusion of Muslim Indians. So I have a whole chapter in the book on, it's actually called, Muslims in a Hindu nation, I think is the title of the chapter. At least that was one of my, Muslims in a Hindu nation is chapter 5 in the book. And I asked the question, how do Muslims fit in today's India? Look, Modi's not a dictator. He's not a fascist. Does he occasionally cross the line between being the prime minister who is the head of a secular government and his personal Hindu faith? I think he occasionally crosses the line. That said, Christian and other religious, Christian leaders in America have much more frequently crossed that line. If we look at Australia, Australia is a post-Christian country. There's not a lot that's Christian about today's Australia. except the holidays. We all get off Easter Monday and Christmas as holidays in Australia. Of course, that would never fly in India. The one place Modi really, I think, crossed the line was with the Ram Mandir and Ayodhya. I think Modi should not have breathed life into the Murtiya. I think that's an inappropriate thing for a prime minister to do. And I think I know why he wanted to do it, because he knew that for the next 1,000 or 2,000 years, that temple is going to be there in Ayodhya, and he will have been the person. That is, I think he let his personal faith override his, well, his Raja Dharma, his duty to the state as a prime minister. That's my personal view. Others will disagree. But if that's all he's done, I think there's not much. Anyone who says that Modi is a fascist because of his statements about Muslims in the book, I contrast Modi's statements with Angela Merkel's statements in Germany. Angela Merkel has said far worse things about her Muslim citizens than Modi has about India's Muslim citizens. And yet no one thinks, well, very few people think Angela Merkel was a fascist. Uh, can an atheist be a Hindu? Yes. I mean, obviously, an atheist can be a Hindu, and that's part of the flexibility of Hindu faith. You're absolutely right. Uh, no, look, the British did not create the modern nation of India. The British ran away from India when it became ungovernable. And one of the least popular things I tend to say is that the one person who's most responsible for accelerating the British withdrawal from India was not Subhash Chandra Bose. It was Muhammad Ali Jinnah. By making India ungovernable, which was his goal on Direct Action Day, he accelerated the timeline of British withdrawal. The British simply could not govern India after World War II, and a lot of that is because of the Muslim League and Muhammad Ali Jinnah. Congress was willing to continue to work with the British. Jinnah was not. Look, thank you, Chris, for saying that about. I'm not opposing academia. I am an academic. I understand what you mean, capital A academia. But I didn't write the book to oppose academia. I wrote the book because I was curious. And I don't let my colleagues' opinions change what I perceive to be the truth. That's all it comes down to. Mazzini is a model, Gandhi. Yeah, so if you go to Hind Swaraj, so everybody, Giuseppe Mazzini was an Italian revolutionary of the middle of the 19th century, but highly influential intellectual in the 19th century. Gandhi would have read Mazzini just as all the, I mean, like I said, Savarkar even translated the life of Mazzini into Marathi. He was so impressed by Mazzini. Lala Lajpat Rai wrote a biography of Mazzini, again, because they found him to be so inspirational. Now, Mazzini has evaporated. If you go to Italy, there'll always be a Via Mazzini in any city in Italy. But even in Italy, Mazzini's not the great hero of Italian independence. The great hero is let's say I'm going to blank on his name, the military leader who united Italy, and that's what Gandhi specifically said
Mussolini,
was no,
Mussolini.
no, no, no. Mussolini's much later. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting I'm forgetting his name. Uh, I'm going to look it up. I'm sorry that it's just Garibaldi, Giuseppe Garibaldi, and Garibaldi was he led the army that brought all of the various Italian states together, and there are via Garibaldis everywhere in Italy. But Gandhi specifically said, those who look to Garibaldi for independence will never win true independence. They'll only win political independence. True independence requires an independence of the soul, and that's what Mazzini wanted for Italy. And if you go back and read Hind Swaraj, read the actual chapter on nonviolence, and he cites Mazzini. So, HCAS, does Western style democracy require a certain level of economic prosperity? That is the argument. The argument is that, and to quote the political scientist, it was no bourgeoisie, no democracy was the mantra. You had to have the rise of a middle class in order to support democracy. I think that's just false, and India shows that it's false because there was no mass middle class in India in the independence era. It was a very, very small group. Can one purchase the book on Amazon? Of course, you can purchase the book on Amazon. That's primarily where it's available. Available globally on Amazon. There will be an Indian edition in December uh, at a much lower price, but currently the Western edition is available in India and, of course, is available globally. And thank you, Vijay Garibaldi. You got it before I had to look it up. So thanks for that. And that runs through all the Q&A. So thank you, everyone, for your engagement. I appreciate it.
Terrific, everybody. And Dr. Salvatore, thank you so much for joining us from Sydney today. We appreciate it very much. And to the audience, thank you for sticking with the webinar and listening.